The sun hung heavy over the island, baking the white stone buildings of San Isidro until they shimmered in the afternoon heat. Palm trees swayed lazily, and the scent of salt and fried plantains drifted from street vendors near the harbor. It was the kind of day that made tourists sigh with contentment, but for the people living here, it was just another Tuesday in a country that had spent decades being told what to do by outsiders. That morning, a small plane landed at the island's single airstrip, kicking up dust as it taxied to a stop. Out stepped a group of well-dressed visitors from a powerful nation far across the ocean. They carried leather briefcases, wore crisp suits despite the humidity, and spoke in calm, measured tones. They'd come to talk business, specifically about the oil rumored to lie beneath the island's coastal waters. Their government called it a mutually beneficial partnership. The island's president, a man who'd grown up fishing these same waters with his father, wasn't so sure. He greeted them warmly at the presidential residence, a modest colonial-style house with peeling paint and ceiling fans that groaned with every rotation. Over glasses of sweet lemonade, the visitors laid out their proposal. In exchange for building a new hospital, a few schools, and a modern port, they wanted exclusive rights to drill for oil for the next 30 years. The payment to the island? A small percentage of the profits, barely enough to cover the cost of running the new facilities they promised to build. The president listened quietly. He'd heard similar offers before, promises wrapped in fine paper delivered with polite smiles, but always ending the same way. The island gave up something precious and got just enough in return to keep people quiet until the next crisis hit. Later that evening, after the guests had retired to their seaside hotel, the president sat with his closest advisors on the veranda. Crickets chirped in the bushes and the sea whispered against the shore. One of his ministers, an older man who remembered when foreign ships used to anchor offshore and demand tribute, leaned forward and said, "They think we're desperate. That we'll take whatever they throw our way." The president smiled faintly. "Let them think that," he said, "but we don't sign away our future for a fresh coat of paint." Back at the hotel, the visiting diplomats were relaxed. Over dinner, one joked that the island's leader was playing hard to get, but he'll fold when the lights go out. They truly believed it. After all, this tiny nation had no army to speak of, no powerful allies, and an economy that wobbled with every shift in global markets. To them, this wasn't coercion, it was just how the world worked. Strong nations made deals. Small ones accepted them. What they didn't know was that the president had spent the last week meeting with fishermen, teachers, and market vendors. He'd heard the same thing from all of them. We don't need their schools if it means losing our sea. The offshore waters weren't just potential oil fields. They were where generations had fished, where children learned to swim, where coral reefs bloomed in colors no map could capture. To hand that over felt less like a deal and more like a betrayal. Still, the president played his part. The next day, he invited the diplomats to a formal lunch under a canopy of bougainvillea. He praised their generosity, nodded thoughtfully at their charts and projections, and even allowed a photo op with local children. But when they pressed him for a signature, he only said, "My people deserve time to understand what we're giving and what we're keeping." The diplomats exchanged glances. They'd expected hesitation, maybe some negotiation, but not this quiet, steady resistance. One of them muttered under his breath, "He's stalling." Another replied, "Doesn't matter. They'll come around. They always do." But as their car pulled away from the presidential residence, the president stood on the steps watching them go. He wasn't angry. He was calm. Because he knew something they didn't. Dignity isn't something you trade for a new building. And sometimes saying no is the most powerful word a small nation can say. That night, as the island slept under a sky thick with stars, the visitors packed their bags, confident the deal was as good as done. They didn't notice the way the locals avoided their eyes in the market the next morning. They didn't hear the radio broadcast's shifting tone, from hopeful to wary. And they certainly didn't imagine that their polite pressure would soon backfire in a way no one saw coming. Because what they mistook for weakness was actually something far more dangerous: patience. And in a place where the sea remembers every ship that's ever passed through, patience has a long memory. The talk started the next morning in a room that smelled of old wood and damp paper. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air. On one side of the long table sat the island's small team, men and women who'd spent their lives working in local government, teaching in schools, or running family farms. On the other side sat the foreign delegation, calm and polished, flipping through folders filled with numbers and legal clauses most islanders had never seen before. At first, it seemed like progress. The visitors spoke of shared prosperity and modernization. They showed glossy brochures of hospitals with gleaming floors and ports with cranes taller than palm trees. But then came the fine print. The oil deal wasn't just about drilling. It came with conditions. The island would have to change its environmental laws. Foreign inspectors would control safety standards. And most importantly, any dispute would be settled not in local courts but in a faraway city where the island had no voice. The president didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "So if your company spills oil in our waters, who cleans it up? Who pays the fishermen who lose their livelihood?" The lead diplomat smiled politely. "Those are hypotheticals," he said. "Our technology is world-class. Accidents don't happen." But the president knew better. He'd seen photos from other places, blackened beaches, dead birds, villages ruined by promises that sounded just like this one. He shook his head. "We can't risk our home for a hypothetical that's already happened elsewhere." Tension thickened the air. The diplomats grew stiffer. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes anymore. By lunchtime, the mood had shifted. What began as a negotiation now felt like a test of wills. That afternoon, the lead diplomat held a press conference outside the government building. Reporters from local radio and a couple of international news outlets gathered under a striped awning. Sweat beaded on foreheads and fans whirred overhead, doing little against the heat. When asked why the talks were stalling, the diplomat sighed, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "Some nations," he said carefully, "aren't ready for the responsibilities that come with real development. We came here in good faith offering partnership. But if leadership isn't serious about progress, well, there are other countries eager to work with us." The words landed like stones. Back in the capital, people heard the broadcast on crackling radios while cooking dinner or fixing nets. In fishing villages along the coast, men paused mid-repair, jaws tightening. In classrooms, teachers turned down the volume and looked at their students with quiet anger. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. The quiet certainty that this island, its people, its choices, didn't truly matter. That evening, something unexpected happened. A young journalist, barely out of university working for a tiny online news site, managed to get into the foreigner's private club. It wasn't hard. He wore a borrowed shirt and carried a notepad like he belonged. Inside, the diplomats were unwinding with drinks, voices loose with relief and rum. "They really thought they could say no?" One laughed. "Give it a week," another said. "Once the power cuts start, they'll be begging us to sign." Honestly, it's cute how they think they have a choice. The journalist recorded it all on a small tape recorder hidden in his pocket. He didn't say a word. Just slipped out, heart pounding, and ran all the way to his editor's house. By midnight, the audio was online. By morning, it was everywhere. Shared on radios, played in bus stations, whispered in markets. People weren't just angry, they felt seen. Not as partners, not as equals, but as obstacles to be worn down. Protests began before lunch. Not violent, not chaotic, but steady. Fishermen brought their boats to the harbor and stood on the decks in silence. Students held signs that read, "Our sea, our choice." Women sold bread wrapped in flyers quoting the diplomat's own words. Even shopkeepers who usually avoided politics hung handwritten notes in their windows. "We don't need your pity. We need respect." The president watched it all from his office. He hadn't called for protests. He hadn't asked anyone to march. But he saw in their faces what he'd felt all along. This wasn't just about oil. It was about who got to decide the island's future. That same day he made a decision. 2 junior members of the foreign delegation, those caught on tape making the cruelest remarks, were declared persona non grata and given 24 hours to leave. It was a small move, but symbolic. The message was clear: we hear you, and we won't pretend we don't. Back in the capital city of the powerful nation, officials barely blinked. Over coffee in quiet offices, they chuckled. "Let them play hero," one said. "They'll be back on their knees when the lights go out." They believed it completely. After all, the island depended on imported fuel. No deal meant no money. No money meant no electricity. And no electricity meant chaos. They didn't consider that people who've lived through hurricanes, droughts, and coups know how to survive in the dark. They didn't realize that pride, once awakened, doesn't fade with the streetlights. In San Isidro, families began preparing. Old generators were pulled from sheds. Candles were stockpiled. Neighbors shared batteries and bottled water. There was fear, yes, but also a strange kind of unity. For the first time in years, people weren't just thinking about their own struggles. They were thinking about each other. And high above, in a room with a view of the sea, the president sat alone, staring at a map of the coastline. He knew the real pressure hadn't started yet. The laughter, the insults, the expulsion, it was all just the opening act. The powerful never give up that easily. If words didn't work, they'd try something else. Something heavier. He just didn't know it would come on the water. Weeks passed, and the island began to feel the squeeze. At first, it was small things. Delays in shipments of medicine, a sudden hike in the price of diesel, banks overseas refusing to process transfers. Then came the bigger blows. A major aid package was paused for review. A promised loan for clean water projects vanished from official emails. Even the fishing boats had trouble. Insurance companies doubled their premiums overnight, claiming increased regional risk. No one said it outright, but everyone knew this was punishment. In the capital, the lights flickered more often. Some neighborhoods went dark by 9 p.m., not because the generators failed, but because there wasn't enough fuel to keep them running all night. People adapted. Families gathered on porches, telling stories by candlelight. Kids did homework under battery-powered lanterns. Street vendors sold cold drinks from coolers wrapped in wet burlap. Life slowed down, but it didn't stop. The president spent his days meeting with farmers, engineers, teachers, anyone with an idea to keep things moving. He turned down offers from shadowy middlemen who promised quick cash in exchange for secret deals. "We don't trade our soul for a full tank," he told one such visitor, politely but firmly. Instead, he reached out to countries that didn't speak the same language but understood what it meant to be small in a world of giants. A few offered modest help: solar panels, medical supplies, even a shipment of rice. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was enough to show the island wasn't alone. Meanwhile, far away, in offices with thick carpets and soundproof walls, decisions were being made. The diplomats had reported back. The leader is stubborn. The people are restless but not broken. That wasn't good enough. Something stronger was needed. Something that wouldn't leave a paper trail, but would make the point unmistakably clear. Unseen by the island's outdated radar systems, a warship slipped out of a distant naval base. It wasn't heading straight for the island. Not yet. Officially, it was on a training mission in international waters. But its course was no accident. Satellite images showed it moving steadily south, cutting through calm seas like a blade. Back on the island, rumors began to swirl. A fisherman claimed he'd heard strange radio chatter on his boat. A Coast Guard officer mentioned unusual blips on an old screen. But without proof, it was easy to dismiss as fear talking. Even the president's closest advisors urged caution. They wouldn't risk it, one said. Not now. The world's watching, another added. Besides, what could a ship really do? It can't invade. It can't shoot. But the president remembered stories his grandfather used to tell about foreign vessels anchoring just outside the bay, cannons pointed toward town, waiting. Not firing, just waiting. That was the point. You didn't need to fire a shot when your presence alone made people feel small. Still, he couldn't ignore the signs. He quietly doubled patrols along the coast, ordered old fishing boats to keep watch near the outer reefs, had school children practice emergency drills, not for war but for civil readiness, just in case. He didn't want panic. He wanted preparedness. At night, he walked the shoreline alone, boots sinking into wet sand. The sea was calm, whispering secrets to the moon. He thought about his father, who'd once rowed out at dawn to check lobster traps, trusting the water like an old friend. Now that same water might bring something cold and metal, something that didn't care about memories or generations. In the capital, life went on, but with a new kind of quiet. People spoke in lower voices, glanced at the horizon more often. When a plane flew overhead, more than one person looked up, wondering. Then one morning, a young radio operator at the coast station froze. His screen showed a large, steady blip moving slowly toward the island's exclusive economic zone. It wasn't a cargo ship. It wasn't a cruise liner. The signature matched a guided missile frigate, one of the most advanced in the world. He called his commander. His voice shook only a little. Something's out there, big, and it's not turning. Within hours, word spread, not through official channels, but through the island's oldest network, people talking to people. The baker told the milkman. The teacher told the parents at school pickup. By noon, half the town knew a warship was coming. Panic didn't erupt. Instead, something deeper stirred. A mix of fear, yes, but also defiance. Fishermen tightened their nets. Shopkeepers checked their shutters. Mothers hugged their children a little longer before sending them to school. The president called an emergency meeting. His generals wanted to issue a formal protest. His diplomats urged silence, hoping the ship would just pass by. But the president knew better. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message written in steel and sonar. He made a decision. No weapons would be raised. No threats shouted. But the island would not pretend it didn't see what was happening. He ordered the Coast Guard to monitor the ship's position every hour. And he told his press secretary, "Get the cameras ready. If they want to show their power, let the world see it too." That night, as the island slept under a sky full of stars, the warship glided closer, silent, massive, and utterly out of place in these gentle waters. It stopped just beyond the legal limit, its lights blinking like cold eyes in the dark. And in San Isidro, the president stood on his balcony, looking out at the sea. He didn't flinch. He didn't rage. He simply whispered, "So this is how it's done now." But deep down, he already knew his next move. Because when you can't match force with force, you fight with truth. And truth, unlike warships, doesn't need fuel to keep moving. Dawn broke soft and pink over the island, but no one was sleeping. Word had spread through every village, every fishing cove, every hillside home. A warship was parked just beyond the horizon. Not attacking. Not speaking. Just there, like a shadow that refused to move. People gathered on rooftops, on cliffs, on the decks of small boats, squinting toward the sea. Through binoculars borrowed from school science labs or old military surplus, they saw it. A long, gray shape cutting the water like a blade, antennas bristling, helicopters sitting silent on its deck. It looked nothing like the colorful cargo ships or cruise liners they were used to. This thing was built for power, not people. At first, fear rippled through the streets. Mothers pulled children inside. Shopkeepers delayed opening, but then something shifted. A fisherman named Luis, who'd spent 40 years reading the moods of the sea, stood on the dock and said out loud, "They think we're scared of a big boat? We've faced hurricanes bigger than that." His words traveled fast. By mid-morning, the mood wasn't panic. It was pride. The president didn't call for protests or speeches. Instead, he did something unexpected. He invited every journalist still on the island, local reporters, a couple of freelance foreigners, even a student with a handheld camera, to the Coast Guard station. "Come see for yourself," he said, "and show the world what's really happening." Within hours, cameras were rolling. Live radio broadcasts described the ship's position. A young woman with a shaky phone filmed from a fishing skiff as it circled just outside the warship's path, close enough to show scale, far enough to stay safe. The contrast was striking. On one side, a massive vessel bristling with technology. On the other, a wooden boat with peeling paint and a man in a straw hat waving calmly. Photos went up online. Videos spread, not with angry captions, but with simple facts. "This is our home. That ship is not." The island wasn't shouting. It was showing. And the world began to notice. Meanwhile, the foreign embassy issued a dry statement. The vessel is conducting routine maritime operations in international waters. There is no cause for concern. But the words rang hollow, because everyone knew. Routine doesn't mean parking a warship off someone's coast right after they say no to your deal. Back in the capital city of the powerful nation, officials scrambled. News networks that had ignored the island for years now ran segments titled, "David and Goliath at Sea." Social media filled with maps, timelines, and side-by-side images of the frigate and the island's tiny Coast Guard boats. Even school kids in other countries started asking, "Why is that ship there?" The pressure wasn't coming from armies or threats. It was coming from ordinary people watching from their living rooms, wondering how a peaceful island could be treated like this in the modern age. On the island, life didn't stop. Fishermen still went out at dawn. Teachers still held class, though now they sometimes pointed to the horizon and said, "See that? That's why we learn about rights and history." Vendors sold coffee and bread as usual, but now their chatter included updates. Still there. No movement. Helicopter flew low this morning. One afternoon, the president walked down to the main beach, not with guards. Not with fanfare, just in a simple shirt and sandals. Children playing in the surf stopped to stare. He smiled, waved, and sat on the warm sand looking out at the sea. Reporters hovered at a distance, but he didn't give a speech. He just sat. And in that quiet act, he sent a message louder than any megaphone. We are not afraid. This is our home. We are staying. That evening, he finally spoke. Not on state radio, but on every local station in the language everyone understood. His voice was calm, steady, like a father talking to his children after a storm. They sent a warship, he said, because they believe size is everything, that a big ship means big power. But here we measure strength differently. We measure it in how we care for each other. In how we protect what's ours, not with guns, but with unity. He didn't insult the other nation. He didn't threaten. He simply reminded his people and the world who they were. They think we'll back down because we're small. But small doesn't mean silent. And it sure doesn't mean for sale. The speech didn't last long. But by midnight it had been shared thousands of times. In cities across continents, people who'd never heard of the island before now knew its name. Petitions started. Universities held teach-ins. Even some lawmakers in the powerful nation began asking uncomfortable questions in Parliament. Is this really who we are? On the water, the warship remained. But its presence no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a mistake. Because the island hadn't cowered. Instead, it had turned the spotlight around, shining it right back on the ship, on the policy, on the arrogance behind it all. And in homes across the island, people gathered again under dim lights, not in fear, but in quiet determination. They shared food, told stories, and kept watch. Not because they expected an attack, but because they refused to look away. The warship had come to remind them of their place in the world. Instead, it reminded the world of theirs. 3 days after the warship appeared, it was gone. No announcement. No fanfare. Just an empty stretch of blue where a hulking gray shape had loomed for so long. Fishermen were the first to notice, out before sunrise, casting their nets, scanning the horizon like they always did. One radioed back to shore. It's gone, just vanished in the night. Relief washed over the island, but it wasn't the kind that comes from surrender. It was the quiet pride of knowing they hadn't blinked. They'd stood their ground, not with weapons, not with threats, but with truth, unity, and the simple courage to say, "This is ours." Back in the capital of the powerful nation, the retreat was framed as mission accomplished and routine repositioning, but everyone knew better. The pressure had become too heavy. News outlets that once ignored the island now ran follow-up stories. How a small nation stared down a warship. Diplomats who'd laughed over cocktails weeks before now gave tight-lipped interviews, avoiding eye contact with cameras. The lead envoy quietly resigned, citing personal reasons. No one believed it. For the island, the real victory wasn't just the ship leaving. It was what came next. Offers began arriving from unexpected places. A European country proposed a fairer oil partnership with strict environmental rules and real profit sharing. A regional alliance invited them to join a new trade group that respected sovereignty. Even former skeptics among the island's own people now spoke with a new kind of hope. The president didn't celebrate with parades or grand speeches. Instead, he visited the fishing villages, the schools, the small farms that had kept going even when the lights went out. He listened more than he talked. And when people thanked him, he always said the same thing. "You're the ones who held the line. I just stood where you put me." Life slowly returned to normal, but not the old normal. Something had changed. People walked taller. Decisions were made with more care, more pride. Children in school now learned not just about math and history, but about rights, about how small voices, when joined together, can echo across oceans. Years later, tourists would come to the island and ask about the famous standoff. Locals would point to a spot on the coast and say, "Right there. That's where the big ship sat." And they'd tell the story not as a tale of fear, but of quiet strength. How their home, though small, refused to be treated as less than. The harbor was eventually upgraded, not by a foreign power, but with careful planning and fair partnerships. Solar panels dotted rooftops. The hospital got new equipment, paid for with real revenue from sustainable fishing and ecotourism, not oil deals signed in desperation. And every year, on the anniversary of those tense days, the community held a simple gathering at sunset. No politicians, no cameras, just neighbors sharing food and remembering how they chose dignity over ease. As for the warship, it faded into history, a footnote in naval logs. But on the island, it became a lesson passed down, that true power isn't measured in steel or engines, but in the willingness to protect what matters, without losing your humanity in the process. The president grew older, his hair turning gray, his steps slower. But whenever he walked the beach at dawn, fishermen would nod to him not as a leader but as one of them. And sometimes when the sea was calm and the sky clear, he'd pause, look out at the water and smile, not in triumph but in peace, because in the end, they hadn't just saved their coastline. They'd reminded the world that even the smallest voice deserves to be heard, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand your ground, look the storm in the eye and say, "Not here, not today." And that, more than any treaty or deal, became the island's real treasure.